Our next speaker, PHYLLIS Budinger, was born and raised in Northeast Ohio. She holds 2 degrees in chemistry, a BS from Baldwin Wallace College, Ohio, and MS from Miami University, Ohio. She joined Sohio, the original Standard Oil Company, in 1964. And through a series of mergers and takeovers, the company ultimately became BP Amoco. PHYLLIS retired with the rank of research scientist from BP Amoco in August of 1999, and her 35 years of experience has been devoted to some facet of troubleshooting and problem solving for BP businesses. She has extensive experience in analysis using spectroscopic techniques, infrared and nuclear magnetic resonance, and has a working knowledge of most other analytical techniques. A lifelong interest in the mystery of the UFO phenomenon was the impetus for her to establish a small laboratory dedicated to the study of physical traces related to UFO events. Frontier Analysis Limited was launched in March 2000. Since then, the laboratory has examined numerous UFO trace samples from all over the world. These include samples from abductions, cattle mutilations, crop circles, UFO deposits, and even angel hair. Some highly visible cases for which analysis have been provided include soil traces from the Delphos, Kansas landing event, bedding material from a 2002 alleged abduction case in Brazil, the Betty Hill dress, and assorted samples from Stan Romanek's experience. She's a very, very interesting lady, and we're delighted that she's here. So, UFOs, a search for physical evidence. Please welcome PHYLLIS Budinger.
Thank you, Tracy. And good morning. As you see, UFOs, a search for physical evidence, is the title of my talk. Now, if I can get that up on the screen, I'm going to do this by PowerPoint. Okay, there we go, thank you. And in retrospect, I probably should have called it the analysis of physical evidence. Actually, there's all kinds of physical evidence. For example, Ted Phillips' database documents over 3,000 cases from all over the world. However, in-depth chemical analysis of physical traces related to the UFO phenomenon has only on rare occasions been adequately done, and I've been engaged in trying to correct these situations for the last 6 years. And in that short time, I've examined physical traces from a number of purported UFO events. And as Tracy said, these include abductions, cattle mutilations, crop circles, angel hair, and possible UFO deposits. For this presentation, I chose to discuss the analyses that I did on samples of 2 high-profile abduction cases, one old and one new. And the old case deals with the analysis of the dress that Betty Hill wore on the night of her abduction. And the new case is concerned with one event from the ongoing many experiences of Stan Romanek. These are the analysis of particulates that he found in his hand after one strange episode. I'm going to relate what was found, and I will give you an idea of what analysis we can do with old and new physical traces related to the UFO phenomenon. And very importantly, it will show high-quality information can be obtained if ufologists get artifacts from well-researched events to the proper people. I will submit to you scientific evidence, which certainly indicates something bizarre happened to the Hills and to Stan Romanek. The analysis I have done are valid and would hold up in a court of law. And in fact, I have provided similar analytical testing in my career that have put a few criminals away. Next slide. Okay. Betty Hill. Well, I can't imagine anyone here in this audience who doesn't know about the Betty and Barney Hill abduction. And I'm briefly going to describe it to refresh some of your memories. It was on September 19th, 1961, and Betty and Barney, along with their dachshund Delzy, were returning home to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and their itinerary took them, this was an extended weekend pleasure trip, and their itinerary took them to Niagara Falls, then to Montreal and home. They were traveling south on Route 3 in central New Hampshire, and at approximately 10:15, they noted a bright star which appeared to move erratically. Well, they continued to observe it as it apparently paced them and got closer and closer, and Barney stopped the car and he retrieved a pistol from his trunk. And then after resuming the drive, both Betty and the object through binoculars, and they observed a spinning, flattened circular disc with multicolored lights around the rim. This slide is a representation of the event, and I wish to thank James Neff for permission to use his art. He's the webmaster for the James Rentz website. About 2 miles north of North Woodstock, the object descended, and it hovered about 100 feet in the air, and no spinning was noted, and a blue-white fluorescent glow shined through the windows. The object appeared to be about the size of a 4-engine aircraft, and so Barney stopped the car and got out. Well, he could see several uniformed human-like figures. He was afraid they were about to be abducted, so he jumped in the car and he raced down the road. And suddenly, an irregular beeping sound was heard. The hills felt a tingling sensation and became drowsy. And the next thing they remembered was a second series of beeps as they were passing through Plymouth. Well, it took several more miles before they became fully awake, and the craft was gone. 2 hours were missing time were noted. They both felt clammy and dirty, and Barney's lower abdomen was bothering him. Their wristwatches had quit working, and there were unexplained marks on the car. Well, both Barney and Betty sought therapy, and eventually hypnosis was utilized by Dr. Benjamin Simon, who had no knowledge of or interest in UFOs. Yet the hypnosis suggested that both Barney and Betty had been abducted and subjected to physical examinations. The next 2 slides are paintings of the captors, and these were done by New Hampshire artist Dave Baker from descriptions by Betty Hill, and this is his rendition of the capture. Here are 2 more paintings, and these are the likenesses of the abductors, the leader and the examiner, as described to Baker by Betty Hill. Well, to my knowledge, many details on the history of the dress worn during the abduction event are not documented, though some are. The dress that Betty wore on that night was new. She had worn it only one other day during that weekend, but not the day before the abduction. Therefore, it had never been laundered. And the weather on the night of the event was unusually warm for that time of year, but it was not exceptionally humid. And when the abduction began, Betty recalls that 2 beings were on each side of her and escorted her to the craft with their hands under her armpits. And Betty related that she put up, quote, a hell of a fight before she crossed the threshold of the craft. And I asked her whether she hit with her hands. She says, oh no, I kicked like hell because my arms were restricted. Well, the dress probably suffered stresses here. And while on the craft, she remembers that halfway through the physical examination, they decided to remove the dress. They had difficulties with the zipper. And once removed, the dress ended up on the floor of the craft in a heap. Well, after the event, when Barney and Betty arrived home, she undressed to go to bed. And Betty related the following in a letter to me dated October 31st, 2001, and I quote, when I returned home that morning, I put my dress folded in the bottom of my closet where it remained for several days. When I removed it, it was covered with a pink powder. So I threw it in the trash, but I quickly changed my mind. I decided to put it outdoors in the sun, and the powder blew away, but leaving stains. End of quote. Well, Betty did not notice any odor emanating from the dress. Other damage was also noted. The lining on the right side of the dress was torn from the waist to the hem, and the top of the zipper was ripped. Well, because of the damage to the dress, it obviously could never be worn again. The dress hung on a hanger in Betty's closet for 40 years. It had not been enclosed in a protective bag. No disinfectants, moth repellent, or other chemicals were ever sprayed in the closet. And occasionally, the dress would be taken out and shown to visitors. I might add that Barney immediately had his suit cleaned after the event, and it never developed a pink powder, nor was it discolored. There was no damage at all to his clothing. Okay. The September 2001 issue of the MUFON Journal featured 2 fascinating articles on the Hill's abduction, and these were done in commemoration of the 40th anniversary of the event. One was by Dwight Connolly, Betty and Barney Hill anniversary, Hill case revisited, and the other was by Kathy Marden, Niece Recalls Hill episode. Connolly's article included a recent picture of Betty holding the dress that she wore during the event, along with descriptions of the powdery material and the damage that the dress had suffered. Well, up until then, I was unaware that this dress still existed, and judging from the descriptions, it seemed highly possible that it contained physical evidence of the abduction. And amazingly, I had not seen any reports of an analysis on it. So immediately I sent emails to both Dwight Connolly and Kathy Marden concerning the possibility of acquiring swaths of the dress for analysis. Kathy Marden contacted Betty, who agreed to my request. And by November 3rd, 2001, I had received 2 swaths, one from a discolored area and the other from an area that retained its original color to serve as a control, and the analysis began. Then on July of 2002, I had the distinct pleasure of meeting Betty Hill and Kathy Marden at the MUFON meeting in Rochester, New York, and Betty brought the dress. So I obtained more swaths for analysis. This slide shows the front and the back of the dress, and it's a common sheath-like style with originally a printed design in various shades of blue. It has simple lines with short sleeves, a natural waist, a straight skirt, and it's lined. The exterior is a dress of cellulose acetate as identified in this analysis, and the dress has several swaths cut out of it due to sampling for analysis, as well as souvenirs for some people. Well, extensive discoloration is obvious in 2 areas: along the top half of the dress, especially in the underarms, and to a lesser extent on the bottom of the dress. And these are the areas where Betty says that the pink powder resided. The waist area retains its original blue color. This is the dress inside, showing the lining. It's solid blue and it's cellulose acetate also, but it's woven. And there is no significant discoloring, though a very slight amount is noted in some areas. There are 3 prominent areas on the back side of the skirt. Here. These are stains, and they don't show up too well in the slide, but this is actually one that I cut out, and I'll talk about that later. Well, after showing you these slides, I'll show you the real McCoy. I have the dress here today, and I thank Kathy Marden for bringing it to Denver. And this is the dress. you can see, obviously, there's discoloration, hopefully, if you got a halfway decent vantage point, at the top and the bottom of the dress. And you can see that the waist area is the original blue color. And you can also see that there's some swaths cut out of it. Some of it's for sampling, and as I said, some for souvenirs. And I trust there will never be any more souvenirs taken from this. Betty was rather cavalier and generous in supplying friends with these samples. Here's the back of the dress. Again, there's pink discoloration at the top. The waist area retains, for the most part, its original blue color. And of course, the bottom is, has the pink discoloration. The most extensive discoloring is actually on the underarms. I can't see it too well, but that's what you can see. Perhaps a little bit you can see it. I think you'll find interesting the inside. Turn it inside out. And here you see where the lining is ripped from the waist to the hem. From your vantage point, you can't see it too well, but there is damage to the zipper area. You can see it a little bit, maybe. And in the back, on the skirt, let's see if I can find them here. There are 3 stains. I know there are. But anyway, I'll show you. This is where one stained area was, which I cut out for analysis, as I'll get to you later on. I thought there were a couple more stains up here, but I don't see them. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just put this dress here so you can observe it while I'm giving the rest of the talk. Let me turn it right side out. I'll just put it over the... Okay. Well, the dress will be returned to Kathy after this talk, and it will go under lock and key, so I can't give anyone a personal showing. You're just going to have to appeal to Kathy. But she will preserve this dress for posterity and also for future study by possible technology which hasn't been developed yet. Well, you're about to hear about the scientific analysis of this dress, and I have to tell you that this analysis became rather personal with me as I became more and more deeply involved and evaluated the data. I began to realize that there was a possibility that I was dealing with the very essence of aliens. And I went through a traumatic, oh my God, period for the 3 weeks in the summer of 2002. I did this extensive analysis between November 2001 and October 2003. The data were documented in a 47-page report, and this report details precisely how the lab work was done and includes numerous photographs, infrared spectra, and some nuclear magnetic resonance spectra. I asked 2 esteemed scientists to review the report. One is a longtime colleague and friend, Dr. J. Robert Mooney, who has a molecular spectroscopy background very similar to my own, and he currently teaches in a Southern university. The other was Dr. Colum Kelleher, formerly of the National Institute of Discovery Science, that's NIDS. And he specializes in biochemistry. And neither individual suggested any significant changes. And I might add that the length of the report is extensive, so I'm only going to discuss pertinent tests that revealed important information. Well, whoops, I'm backwards. Well, forgot, I guess I got ahead of myself. Anyway, you can see better the torn zipper in this slide, and in the, I didn't realize I didn't have it up there. And you can see the torn zipper, which you can't see very well from where you're sitting. And then here's the torn lining from the interior. Well, on to sampling. Sampling of any artifact for analysis is important, and Betty's dress was no exception. 4 swaths from the outside of the dress were examined, and these include 3 swaths from the discolored areas and a control from an area that was not discolored. And also analyzed was a swath from the interior lining. This is the one that had a stain. Comparison of the samples clearly show the blue color of the control in contrast to the colored pink color of the other outer swaths. The next slide show you where each came from on the dress and the size in millimeters. This is the control, and it's from the back midsection of the dress, about 3 to 4 inches above the waist and next to the zipper. And it was sampled by Betty Hill and received by myself on November 3rd, 2001. And I just want you to note that it's only designated as a control because it was not discolored. This is swath number 1, and it was sampled from the left sleeve by Betty Hill, and it was received at the same time as the control. This is swath 2, and it's from the front midsection of the dress, and I sampled that in Rochester on July 7th, 2002. And this is swath 3 from the right sleeve underarm, and I sampled it also at Rochester. And finally, this is the lining swath obtained from the inside back skirt section, also examined, excised from the dress at Rochester. And it was selected because of its dark stain, obviously. Well, because the analytical results of the outside swaths, 1, 2, and 3, are so similar to each other, I'll discuss these together, and the analysis showed the lining stain is different, and I'm going to finish with this analysis. Many microscope slides were taken using a Leica GZ6 stereo microscope interfaced to a digital camera. And you can see it's a knitted fabric. And there are a number of differences between the discolored swaths, 1, 2, and 3, in the control. And obviously, the pink color versus the normal blue color of the dress, that's obvious. So therefore, the colorant or the dye of the dress has been compromised. And next is the fiber structure itself. There is a looser fiber structure for the discolored swaths. That is, there's more separation between the rows, as you can see here. Wait a minute. Where's my mouse? Oh, there we go. You can see more space between the rows compared to the control in all 3 swaths. And also you see a less ordered weave. So besides the dye, the material itself has also been attacked. These are just microscope photographs of the backside of the swaths, which show the backsides have also a disordered, looser fiber structure compared to the control. Slide. Oh, okay, this is not flipping as well as it should be, but anyway, you can see that they're also different than the control. There we go. Hit the mouse a little harder. Infrared analysis was done, and numerous infrared spectra were acquired from every square centimeter of the front and back surfaces of all 4 swaths. And this technique is very powerful. It's used for the molecular structure identification and also quantitation of solids, liquids, and gases. Each molecular compound has a unique infrared spectrum, just as each human has a unique DNA profile. As an example, this spectrum is of the control swath of the dress. That's the top red spectrum. And the bottom spectrum is a reference in my files of cellulose acetate. And you can see the traces match and identify the material that Betty's dress is made of. But that's incidental. There's a lot more information that infrared spectroscopy provided about the dress. Here are typical spectra of the control surface. That's the top red spectrum. And the surfaces of the other three swaths. And specifically, these are from the outside of the dress. And of course, all show the cellulose acetate dress material. But look closer at the three bottom spectra of the discolored swaths, the black, pink, and the green. There's additional absorption at 1645, 2911, and 2844 wave numbers. Something else is present. Well, let's look at the back side of each swath. And again, the top red spectrum is of the control. And the spectra are similar to the front side, showing mostly dress material. But again, there's subtle additional absorption at 1645, 2911, and 2244 wave numbers in two of the discolored swaths. Though the absorption does not appear to be as much as on the front of the swaths, but I'll get back to that observation later. Well, I've clearly shown that other substances are present, and thanks to computers, this additional absorption could be enhanced by subtracting the discolored spectra with the control spectrum. And what I did is I effectively nulled out the interfering dress material absorption, and there was enough information on the spectra so that I could identify the substance. There are actually two. And the absorption bands at 1645, and this new band pops out at about 1549. These are typical of protein-amide peptide linkages. And then there's also the enhanced absorption here of the bands I previously mentioned, 2911 and 2844 in wave numbers. And they show that a smaller amount of another material is present, and I'll get back to how that was specifically identified later, but these bands are due to natural glycerol esters, that is a natural oil. Getting back to the protein identification, in this slide, I just wanted to show the comparison of a different spectrum from the previous slide to some protein type references. The top red trace is of the swath number 3 contamination, and the other three are references of protein substances such as gelatin, human skin, and cat hair, and clearly you can see the similarity. So what else does this analysis tell us? Remember that I told you that infrared analysis also provides quantitative information. Well, I decided to take ratio of band intensities, and I took these from all the many spectra obtained from both the front and the back sides of the swaths, and I wanted to look at two ratios. For the first, I measured the band intensities of the protein band, here at 1650. I drew a baseline here, and I measured the intensity. And then I measured the intensity of the 1740 band. That's from the dress material, the cellulose acetate. And these numbers were ratioed. Specifically, the protein band was divided by the dress material band intensity. And it gives an idea as to the relative amount of protein present. And I also wanted an idea of the relative amount of natural oil. So I measured the intensity of the oil band at 2919. Here I drew a baseline and I measured its intensity, and also ratioed it to the dress band intensity at 1740. And the next slide shows the results. Here are the numbers. Across the top of the table, you can see the column designations, that is the control, swath 1, 2, and 3, and the ratio values below them. And I first want to say that the numbers you see are very significant, though they appear low and close. The first two rows, here and here, are the values for the protein ratios for the outside and inside of the swaths. And the last two rows, here and here, show the values for the natural oil. Well, there are a couple of very, very important conclusions that can be drawn from these data. First, compare all the discolored swath values in all three columns to those of the corresponding values of the control. Compare these numbers to the control, these numbers to the control, and all the way down. And in all cases, except one, the values for the discolored swaths are higher than those for the control, showing more protein and natural oil is deposited on the discolored swaths. This is the proof for that. Then there is another very important observation. Compare the protein values for the inside and outside of the swaths. 1, 2, and 3 in the first two rows. These two rows. That is, compare the highlighted area to the values below them, like swath 1 is 0.4 compared to 0.2. Swath 2 is 0.5 compared to 0.3. And for the third swaths, the values are equivalent at 0.4. Well, the higher values for the outside of the swaths, 1, 2, and 3, clearly shows that the protein comes from an external source and not Betty. For swath 3, it's apparent that the dress has completely permeated that side of the dress, and that's the underarm area. Well, the same is true when you look at the values for the inside and outside of the swaths for the natural oil in the last two rows, and you can see for swaths 1 and 2, the values are 0.3 to 0.2. And the values for 3 are equivalent at 0.3. Well, we're not finished. Let's carry this analysis further. There's more that I could do. I decided to do solvent extractions, and I was limited in what I could use because a number of solvents would dissolve the dress material. Cellulose acetate was an especially popular fiber used during the time period of the event in the 1960s. However, there was a problem with exposures to common solvents. For example, nail polish remover could dissolve the fabric and leave holes. Later on, more durable polyesters replaced most applications for the cellulose acetates. So knowing the properties of cellulose acetate and its solubilities, there were two solvents I selected. A nonpolar hydrocarbon hexane, and the universal solvent water, which I knew would not affect the cellulose acetate. The hexane extracts were carefully measured, and the results are in this table. This material was in very minor amounts, yet the data clearly show that there are more extractables in the discolored swaths compared to the control. And note the highlighted values compared to the value of the control. Well, I told you earlier I was going to tell you how the natural ester was identified, and it was in this hexane extraction. Infrared spectra of the hexane solubles from all the discolored swaths are similar to each other and indicate this oil. And in this slide, the top red spectrum of one of the extracts is compared to a triglyceryl ester and a natural oil from human skin, and you can see they're similar. There is some hydroxyl or OH absorption, which suggests some deterioration. Note in the top red spectrum of the extract shows the OH is indicated, the excessive absorption. Well, what this means is the triglyceryl ester has probably deteriorated or hydrolyzed to a mono or diglyceryl ester, and this deterioration would be expected after all these years. Well, I will add that another technique, hydrogen NMR, that's nuclear magnetic resonance, was also done on the extracts, and it supports the infrared analysis. And in the interest of time constraints, I won't go into detail on this, but this is another powerful analytical tool which is used for molecular structure identification, and it nicely complements the infrared analysis. Next, I did water extractions on the sample, and the water extracts were also weighed, and you can see from this table there is significantly more soluble material in swaths 1, 2, and 3 compared to the control. And I might add that there is also more material extracted compared to that extracted by the hexane. These are infrared spectra of the extracts from each swath, and the spectra look like a hodgepodge of things, but very briefly, I'll say they represent a mixture of the same components but at differing concentrations, and these include protein, carboxylic acid salts, and free carboxylic acids. And the fact that the protein is water-soluble indicates it's low in molecular weight. So this observation, along with the presence of the acid salts and free carboxylic acid, suggests protein degradation products. So besides the natural oil, we see some deterioration has also occurred to the protein. The protein material is present in all samples and is greatest in 1, 2, and 3. And the control water extract, which is in much smaller amounts, as shown in the previous slide, is mostly carboxylic acid salts. Hydrogen NMR analysis was also done on this extract and supported the infrared results. This slide shows spectra of the surfaces of the discolored swaths after the extractions were done. These are different spectra, and I nulled out the dress material absorption by subtracting the control swath spectrum from all of the, excuse me, I gotta back up here. Oh dear. Well, go slide. Slide 31. There we go. Anyway, I nulled out the dress material absorption, and I subtracted the control swath spectrum from all of the spectra of the discolored swaths. And as you can see, by now you're spectroscopists, some protein material remains as indicated by this absorption at 1645 and in 1549 in all 3 swaths, some more so than others. So this must be higher molecular weight insoluble protein and indicates that some protein is intact, that is, it has not suffered degradation. Okay, DNA analysis was then done because I felt the evidence that I've presented so far indicated that there was a remote possibility that some of the captor's DNA may have been on the dress. Natural oils and protein substances seem to be the indicators. However, judging from the dress history, I did not know if any intact DNA would remain from the escorts at this amount of time, especially with the indication of a lower molecular weight protein, which suggested that the dress may have suffered a biological attack, but it was worth a shot. DNA analysis was done on all of the swaths except the control, and the biochemist who did the work went the extra mile, incorporating the most modern techniques to enhance any DNA fragments, and they made a project out of it. And I also enlisted the aid of a DNA specialist, I'll call her Dr. M, to review the report, and she does not know the biochemist who did it, and her comments were, I quote, I found the analysis to be pretty good and quite informative. They appeared to be very careful with the DNA extraction process to get all they could from all the samples they had to work with, end of quote. I did not tell Dr. M that the report dealt with a UFO abduction case. In fact, I don't even know if she's interested in the phenomenon or even knows about the Hill case. So what was found? On the left sleeve, we see what is called alpha proteobacterium, and Dr. M relates I quote, "This is bacteria that are found in soils and water. The bacteria could be picked up anywhere, and if the dress was on the ground, some of the bacteria could have gotten there very easily," end of quote. Now, I found that observation quite interesting because from the location of the bacteria, the upper left sleeve, if Betty was wearing the dress, she would have to be in a prone position flat on the ground at some point, and this is highly unlikely. There is only one time we know when the dress was on the, quote, ground, and this was when the dress was removed from Betty and the craft and thrown crumbled on the craft floor. Clearly, some of this bacteria could easily have been from soil or dirt on the floor, brought in on footwear worn by Betty and the escorts. And remember, the abduction took place down a dirt road. As an aside on this, I was talking to Stan yesterday, and he has been at the site about 3 weeks ago, first time he had ever been there, and he says the road is now paved. It was an old logging road, and he says it is now paved, and there's now a house nearby. On the skirt front, only a small DNA fragment was isolated, which was not very definitive. The best we can say is that the DNA is of mammal origin. The fragments suggest human, mouse, or bovine, and I suspect that the fragment is human. On the right sleeve underarm, we see human DNA, and this is not Betty's. I gave the biochemist a sample of Betty's blood for DNA comparison, however, what was found was DNA of someone of African extract, so we speculate that this is from Barney, and Barney may have been escorting Betty at some time during the weekend, leaving some of his DNA, and if so, it's most interesting that the DNA is still intact after all of these years. Well, unfortunately, no strange alien DNA was detected in these particular samples, though not a surprise, but it doesn't mean that it's not there somewhere on the dress. But what was detected was interesting and informative. Well, trying to get the next slide. Well, here we are. We're good. We're go. I'm now going on to the lining analysis, and this is just a reproduction of the slide I had earlier on. And I'm going to be brief in discussing this analysis. I will say that the swaths, that the same analytical approach was used as for the outer swaths. Numerous infrared spectra were taken of the stained and unstained surfaces. Band intensity ratios were taken. Extractions were done, as well as DNA analysis. And I've shown the power of this analytical approach for unraveling valuable information in the discussion of the outside swaths. So again, due to the constraints of time, I'm going to focus on the results. And the results indicated a different material than found on the other swaths. These microscope photographs show the body side and the outer fabric side of the normal area compared to the stained area. Obviously, the lining is a weave. The fiber in the stain area has not suffered damage on either side, and it does not appear to be discolored in the same manner as the outer swaths. Now, regarding infrared analysis, I think I've shown you the power of this technique, so I won't display any more spectra. I'll just say that this analysis shows that the lining is also a cellulose acetate type, like the outer material. It shows the stain is composed of a protein-type material, but different than that found in the discolored swaths. And a very small amount of natural ester or oil-type material is present. This material has permeated the lining fairly well, though there is slightly more on the side facing the outer fabric. In other words, the stain originated from an external source. This slide shows the stained material along with clippings from the stain area that were water extracted. And the water extraction shows this material is totally water soluble. When the extracted fabric, after extraction, the fabric you can see is restored to its original color. So there is no discoloration, and so neither the dye or the fabric were affected, as were the outer discolored swaths. Finally, DNA analysis follows, and it shows spider blood of the genus Colatus terrestris, which is indigenous to the New Hampshire area and probably southern Canada. And there's a few such spots on the lining on the back of the dress, as I said. And so it appears that Betty sat on some spiders, and it's difficult to say when it happened. Kathy Martin relates that hours earlier, Betty had a hot dog in Canada and sat at a picnic table to eat it, and it's a good probability that it happened there. And if not, there's a reasonable probability that it could have happened sometime during the abduction event. Okay, let me summarize what was found by the analysis. The discolored pink magenta areas of the outer dress have suffered chemical attack on both the dye and the fiber, and the fabric is coated with a biologically derived material, which is composed mostly of protein and a small amount of natural ester type oil. And there's some deterioration of these materials which probably occurred over the years. More of these substances are on the exterior of the dress than on the interior for swaths number 1 and 2. And this evidence shows that the substance originates from an external source. And the material has completely permeated swath number 3. There are also assorted DNA fragments, which include bacteria, assorted human, which could be from many people handling the dress over the year, and Barney's DNA is a high probability. And finally, we find that the lining stain is composed of spider blood. Well, I just want to emphasize that the analytical results clearly rule out any natural substances originating from Betty, such as urine, perspiration, and vomit. The material came from an external source, ruling out urine and Betty's perspiration. Also, no uric acid was detected, further eliminating these substances. Vomit was easily eliminated for a number of reasons. That's the location of the discoloration, which, as you've seen, occurs behind the dress and on the underarms and so forth. And also, I would expect considerable solids deposited on the front of the dress had the vomit been involved. Also, there should have been significant amounts of carbohydrates present, and these were not detected. And also, there was also additionally, there was also no bad odor. I have some speculations. It's the best I could come up with. Betty told me that there was a most unpleasant, unidentifiable odor on the craft. And I offer the speculation that this odor could have emanated from the craft occupants and could be the result of natural body elimination of oils and respiratory agents. And I think that these transferred to the dress on contact. The pink areas are most profound around the top of the dress and especially around the sleeves where the occupants had gripped Betty as they escorted her to and from the craft. And the pink on the dress skirt is easily explainable because contact was made with Betty's escorts when she kicked them as she was forcefully taken over the threshold of the craft. Well, the escort on the right may have taken the brunt of the attack because this is where the lining is ripped, and it's also noted that the right sleeve is totally permeated with the material, which may indicate a tighter grip on her was necessary. The moist, damp biological components on the dress were probably also on Betty's skin, causing her to feel clammy and dirty. I do not think that the original deposited substance on the dress directly caused the discoloration. Betty found the discoloration days later when she took the dress out of the closet. The substance on the dress was probably moist, so the moisture was not allowed to dissipate because the dress was folded. And I think that this moist substance, probably slightly acidic, served as a nutrient for natural biological growth, such as bacteria, mold, or mildew, and this grew. Days later, the dress finally dried, and a pink powdery residue from the growth remained. And it was this biological growth material that probably caused the discoloration and possibly interacted with the dress fiber. The dress interior and dryer lining probably suffered at most minimal effects. Well, it would appear that small remnants of the original traces of the materials remained, for example, the soil bacteria. And as previously mentioned, I find it likely that the soil bacteria found on the left sleeve got there when the dress was thrown on the craft floor. And as I said, the event occurred on a rural area on a dirt road. And clearly, dirt could have been tracked in by footwear worn by Betty and the craft occupants. And we finally know that at some point during the weekend, Betty sat on some spiders. And we do know that she sat at a picnic table several hours before the event. So it possibly could have happened there. And if not, the probability increases that it happened during the abduction event. Okay, you have the evidence. You saw the damage on this dress. This was literally a new dress reduced to a rag as a result of a bizarre event. There's absolutely no question in my mind. Also, the chemical analysis supports Betty's account of the event. I found nothing that would contradict her story. Some acknowledgments are in order. It takes a number of people to ensure the best analysis. I'm indebted to Kathleen Marden for communicating my desire to analyze the dress to her Aunt Betty Hill, and as well as helping in a number of other ways. Thanks go to Dr. Colum Kelleher, formerly of NIDS, for his critiquing the data and his constructive comments. I'm also appreciative of the NMR spectra provided by Dr. J. Robert Mooney, as well as his comments on the data presented. And I'm grateful for the help of Bill Chalker for putting me in touch with the biochemist who did the DNA analysis. And of course, there's the biochemist who made the extra effort and provided in-depth DNA information. There's Dr. M, a DNA expert who I consulted for a second opinion. And I must acknowledge and thank my husband, Bruce Budinger, for his thoughts, help, and indulgence in putting up with me throughout the analysis. Whoops, darn. I want to back up here. Slide 41. This is the most important acknowledgement of all, and I went over it here. Most of all, I want to acknowledge Betty Hill. She graciously donated the dress swaths for analysis, as well as offered keen descriptive input regarding the details of the event and the dress history. She was a delightful, feisty, tiny lady with a wonderful sense of humor, and I admired her gigantic resolve and her moxie to stand up against her critics, and I hope this analysis provides her some redemption in kind. Okay. On to Stan Romanek. Now, Stan Romanek is a man that ordinarily would not command a lot of attention. He has a high school education and he's dyslexic. His math competency is on a 5th grade level. And like most of us, he toils to make ends meet and raise his kids. However, there's one great difference from many of us. He's a man who has had a number of bizarre encounters, and they're increasing. These are ongoing, as I indicated. And you can find detailed reports of some of his experiences in the MUFON Journal, many websites, talk radio, and his case was discussed in last year's symposium by Deborah Lindemann. His events include typical elements observed in other abduction cases, and let me briefly list some of these. He's had a number of UFO sightings with several witnesses. The top picture is from a videotape taken by Stan, and the bottom 3 are drawings done by 3 witnesses from the same event. He did not know the witnesses, and obviously there's a similarity. And this sighting occurred in a park on September 30th, 2001, here in the Denver area. There have been physical markings on Stan's body, such as fluorescing areas on his body when observed under black light, as well as triangular wounds on his back. And these are markings from an event which occurred September 20th, 2001, also in Colorado. Under hypnotic regression, Stan has written complicated mathematical equations. And remember, he has a 5th grade math competency level. And this one is of the Drake equation, only it's modified and it's multiplied times 100. This equation predicts the number of intelligent communicating civilization which are in our galaxy. He was also able to remember encounters with entities, and this is a sketch he did of them a few months after the hypnotic regression, and he calls them the possum people. And of course, there's missing time. Well, I'm going to discuss the analysis of physical evidence from one of Stan's events, and this unusual event occurred in Nebraska on November 17th, 2002. And the only conscious memory of this event by Stan is that he found himself outside of his house at approximately 3 a.m. in the morning. He found himself next to his apple tree, and he was dressed only in his underwear. He was barefoot, cold, and he was locked out of his house. And his wife, Lisa, let him in and noted marks on his back. He was sick, and he vomited. In his tightly clenched hand, he held an unknown material, and he had no idea where it came from. And my task was to analyze this substance. This is a photograph of some of the material found in his hand. Stan took this photograph. The particles are dark gray and are a fairly good size. The sampling I received of these particles were small. They had broken down and were only about 0.1 to 1 millimeter in size. Well, when the sample first came in, I did the routine test normally done on most UFO-related samples like this one. A check was made for radioactivity with a Geiger counter. There was none. It was not attracted to a magnet, nor did it fluoresce under UV light. What followed were a number of analytical techniques to identify this material, and each has its advantages and limitations, but as a whole, it gave a very accurate picture as to its composition. First, let's look at the microscope pictures. Examination of the hand substance using a stereo microscope shows it's a heterogeneous mixture. There's a predominance of dark gray particles and a slightly lesser amount of light gray particles. And the light gray particles are extremely interesting because they have a foamy, vitreous-like appearance. You can see them here and here, bubbly effect. And in some instances, the light gray material is also attached to a dark gray particle. There are also a few white and brown particles, and there was one white hair in the sample. Not all are shown in this slide. These are scanning electron microscope photographs taken by Nick Ryder. This is a very, very powerful microscope capable of extremely high magnifications, though these photographs were taken at 100x magnification. The light gray material on the left appears vitrified. It's on the right. Your left. Appears vitrified and bubbled like pumice stone. That is glass-like substances that have been exposed to high temperatures. The dark gray material looks like convoluted lumps of thin sheets. I'm also including a photograph of a 2000x magnification of a dark gray particle because I found it rather interesting. Here you can see aggregates of needle-like crystals appear on the dark gray material, and the length of the needles appears to be between 2 and 5 microns. EDS analysis was done, and EDS stands for Energy Dispersive X-ray Spectroscopy. And this test identifies elements that can give semi-quantitative amounts of elements. Here are two spectra, one of the dark gray particles and the other of the light gray particles. And the same elements are present in both samples, though the concentration varies. Note that the dark gray spectrum shows a major amount of bismuth and a smaller amount of silicon with traces of other minor elements. In the light gray material, silicon predominates with the smaller amounts of bismuth, along with the same minor amounts of the same elements detected in the dark gray material. A semi-quantitative estimate could be made as to the relative amounts of elements in each sample. The numbers in this table are actually averages of 2 runs per particulate type. By ratioing the spectrum peak intensities in the EDS spectra, we find most obvious is a significant decrease in bismuth in the light gray particles, that is 26% to 63% in the dark gray. And it's also noted that silicon, aluminum, and oxygen significantly increase, indicating they possibly belong to aluminum silicate type material. Well, EDS is an excellent technique for elemental identification, and it certainly provided an eye-opening identification with bismuth. But it doesn't tell the full story. How are these elements combined? There are 2 techniques that can do that for us, and each contributes a bit of information. And the first is XRD, that is X-ray diffraction. And this technique is used for the identification of crystalline species in solids. And Dr. Sammy Yenger ran this diffractogram. He did not separate the light gray and dark gray particulates, but he ground them all together. He needed the sample volume. The blue plot is the diffractogram of the sample, and the bottom stick patterns are from references of beta bismuth trioxide in red and bismuth metal in green. Clearly, the reference stick patterns of bismuth oxide and bismuth metal line up with the diffractogram peaks of the sample. So the bismuth is mostly present. It's predominantly bismuth trioxide with a smaller amount of elemental bismuth. Yet there's silicon present, and as I said before, the material has to be crystalline to be detected by XRD. So the silicon has to be in an amorphous state that is vitreous, as indicated by the microscopy photographs. Infrared spectroscopy came into play here. The top spectrum is of a light gray particle, and you'll note that it compares to a reference spectrum of glass, an amorphous silicon oxide. So this is a silicate that has been obviously exposed to high temperature. The bismuth trioxide has no absorption in the mid-infrared region, so we could not detect it by this test. These are spectra of the dark gray particles and a reference of fired clay. Again, there's a close similarity between the two. And though we know bismuth trioxide predominates in the dark gray particulates, again, it can't be detected by infrared analysis. Well, I also took infrared analysis of other particles, and these were in very minor amounts and probably contamination. Identified were skin cells, pet hair, plastic fragments, dirt, and plant-derived material. This slide shows a summary of the analysis. The substance found in Stan's hand is a heterogeneous mixture of particles. The major portion consists of dark gray particles, which are mostly beta bismuth trioxide, with a small amount of elemental bismuth. And also present is a moderate amount of light gray particles, which is mostly vitreous, that is glass-like silica. Both dark and light gray particulates seem to have been exposed to high temperature. For example, for the silica to be glass-like, it had to have experienced high heat in formation. And also, I've been told that beta bismuth trioxide requires high heat for its formation. And there are also trace amounts of other particulates, which are most likely contaminants. And these, as I mentioned, are the skin cells, pet hair, and so forth. I have consulted with 2 material scientists on this material, and I found that it is definitely not a naturally occurring substance. It is synthetic, and of course they confirmed high heat had to be involved in its manufacture. The most probable explanation is that the composition could represent a ceramic or glass. Bismuth trioxide ceramics are used in the electronics industry. Bismuth trioxide in the 50 to 75% range lowers the processing temperature from a typical 1400 degrees C to around 1000 degrees C in ceramic processing. I found out that there's a wide range of application for this material in ceramics and in warm superconductors. Okay, you have the evidence. This is an uncommon material for Stan to have in his hand. It is highly improbable that he picked it up in his backyard or house. And no matter what the composition represents, it indicates that Stan was elsewhere that night. And it's a clue to where he might have been. And it suggests something bizarre happened to Stan on November 17th, 2002. Well, as with the Betty Hill analysis, again, it takes a coordinated effort to ensure a most accurate analysis. I wish to acknowledge Stan Romanek, who carefully gathered and preserved the physical evidence. Then there's Nancy Talbot for the coordination of communication. Nick Ryder provided both SEM and EDS analysis. Dr. Sam Iyengar did the XRD analysis. And finally, there's Dr. IS and Dr. AS, both material scientists, who I thank for their comments on the analytical results. And I thank MUFON for the opportunity to present these analyses, and I thank you all for listening. I have 6 minutes remaining if anyone has any questions.
Might emission spectroscopy and other tests be used in the first analyses?
Could you step up to the mic?
Could you go on the microphone? Might emission, what?
Yeah, I wondered if emission spectroscopy might have been used in your first analyses, or did they not have any use in that analysis?
Actually, I became aware of analyses just recently, and I think They did use EDS analysis on it, but it was not a well-done analysis. For instance, when they referred to the sample they didn't use the proper words for in describing the results of the analysis. Yeah, it was done, but it would not provide any pertinent pertinent information regarding the organic content, which I essentially nailed down with the infrared analysis.
So there was no inorganic content?
Yeah, from what I could see, there was from this emission analysis, I saw silicon and so forth, which would be possibly from dirt, normally dust-type particles that you'd find in a dress that would be in a closet for 40 years. So it did show that, but it was mostly dirt, magnesium, typical elements that you would find in dirt.
I see. And there was no need for mass spectrometry?
I don't know if that was done or not. I know there's other analysis that were done. No, there was not for what I was doing. No, I thought that IR and NMR pretty well nailed it down.
I see.
And besides, I also, tests like that I have to send out for, and it becomes very expensive. And DNA broke my budget.
All right. Thank you very much.
You mentioned that Betty threw the dress in the trash can and then retrieved it. Could that have affected your results in any way?
It may have, but my gut feeling is it didn't, because she just threw it in and brought it out, and I'm positive it did not. It would not have been. This pink material, it's all through the dress. And no, I don't think that happened. I had thought that that's a possibility, but no, there's no way.
Thank you.
Can you expound on the materials given to you by Chuck Wade?
Chuck Wade.
Yes.
Which are these?
They came from New Mexico. I think there were 7 metallic items.
Yeah, I do have these materials. I can't expound on them because right now I haven't done anything on them. I will say that they do have the appearance, well, most of them do, of an aluminum foil type material. And the other one is more of a metal piece.
Yes.
I can't tell you more, except there was an analysis done, and I do have the results of that, and it was EDS, and I think they found that the major element was aluminum.
Thank you.
And that's all I can tell you about it right now.
Thank you.
Hello, you had made a number of references to the items that Stan Romanek had in his hands as to high heat. I assume you're talking about a little higher than Denver's heat today, but how hot and what would you relate that to, that kind of heat?
Well, like I said, I do know that in processing ceramics with bismuth in it, it was probably over, well, it lowers the processing temperature, which is the good part about bismuth trioxide. And I would say probably around 1,000 degrees or a bit higher.
Fahrenheit or centigrade?
Pardon?
Fahrenheit?
Oh, centigrade.
Fahrenheit, what does that translate to? I'm not a scientist.
Oh, geez. 18.
Thank you.
Thank you, my husband. He's a chemist, too.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Hi, you mentioned one of the contaminants might have been pet hair. Was that hair analyzed to see if it was pet?
No,
Did Stan have any
There
pets?
was one little hair. It was a white hair, and it blew out of the spectrometer. So somewhere it's in my lab. But Stan says he has a white cat.
Okay, so it'd be consistent with that.
Yeah, so it would be consistent. Yeah, it would be a good,
Okay, thank you.
subject for DNA if it was alien. Yeah, thank you.
Are the amounts of material that were found on Betty Hill's dress consistent with what you would expect if if the escorts had been human?
You know, I don't think I can answer that. The amounts of materials, you got to realize too that I think I was looking at stuff from the result of bacterial attack, as well as, so, you know, it's hard to say. I don't know what it would be, what that would be. I can't answer that really good.
When we run into new cases in which people have stained clothing or other interesting debris, what should we look for? What should we collect? In a sense, when we go in as an investigator and somebody gives us something like this, what's the best way to store it safely so we'll have the most information?
Well, I prefer it in a clean glass. It depends on the sample. Like Stan's, it would be best to be put into a clean, very clean glass jar or vial. In fact, I think I received it in that. I'm not sure. It was a plastic vial, which I prefer glass, because plastic has plasticizers and things that can interfere with my analysis.
Yeah, I've heard of at least one case where they found some very anomalous dust particles in a house that had been repeatedly visited by something or other. They were really odd looking, but I don't know any further analysis on that one. What should we look for?
Well, if it's anomalous, you should get it to an analyst and put it into a clean, sterile vial for somebody, you know, to analyze. I don't know what you should look for outside of. I found something unusual, you know, and document the case well and so forth, and get it to an analyst.
Okay.
On Stan's case, did I understand you to say that you concluded that this ceramic material had to have originated from somewhere other than his home?
Oh, yeah.
Unless a visual inspection was done of the rooms and the home and in the drawers, in the closets, was that done?
Stan told me this was done by the investigators in the case.
Okay.
And so it was
drawers were open, closets were open.
Sure, yes.
You know, TV, stereos,
Yeah.
any computer equipment that he might have had, crockery in the.
This type of material doesn't show up in the home. You know,
Okay.
It's something that's used for specialized purposes.
One other question about Betty Hill. You indicated there were three spiders, evidence of three spiders.
Yeah.
Did Betty ever report any itching from bites or rashes from spider bites along the time?
What happened, I meant to look at this dress closely with a microscope. Well, I should have with a microscope, but anyway, a magnifying glass on the outer, because I was going to look for any evidence of spider exoskeleton, and I haven't done that yet. So, but no, when she sat on them, they were squashed and dead before they could do anything.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm sorry we can't take the questions first. There's just a couple of announcements before we close for lunch. Thank you, Phyllis. That was a fascinating presentation. Luncheon is going to be in Salon A, B, and C. And we're back here at 1:15 with our dear friend, Dr. Roger Lear, talking about alien plants, which is going to be another phenomenal presentation. And just a reminder to please switch off your cell phones during all presentations, if that's okay. Also, the videotape of the presentation.
Presenting that.
Well, you know, when you present something